This class is sort of for anybody, no matter what your belief system is. You know, you could say a lot of us might be Christians, but then look at all the types of different churches there are. So clearly Christians all have different views on things. In the Christian world, we tend to not be able to agree on much. So, so the first thing I want to say is a little like, these are arguments from what is called natural theology. Now, what natural theology is that it is the study of God based on like the observed world or based on the natural world. It is not, if you're someone of faith, you practice what is called revealed theology, is that God has revealed himself, whether through scripture, whether through some experience you may have had. So this is not that. And so this is not, I can't think of the word, but this is something that you could disagree with. You know, if you don't like some of the things that are presented here tonight, you know, it's a view from men about God. It's not the other way around. You know, so it's not a doctrine. It's not anything that questions your faith. So any objections you might have, we'll bring them up and then we'll talk about them. The other thing is, natural theology is it's a branch of philosophy. Now, I didn't want to advertise this as like a philosophy class because it sort of, you know, can make people cringe. It's just, I think of my parents because I have an art degree. And I think the only comfort my parents might have is that, well, at least it's not a philosophy degree. There's a quote I really like about philosophy. It's from this guy, H.L. Mencken. And he said that a philosopher is a blind man in a dark room looking for a black cat that isn't there. Despite all that, though, everyone practices philosophy, even if they don't know it. Everyone has a worldview that you live your life by. So every day, whether it be an ethical system that you apply to the world, these decisions that you make, like what you think the meaning of your life is, what you try to do when you raise your children, these are all philosophy issues. Like, you have a worldview. You're practicing philosophy every single day. So as much flack as we like to give philosophy, like, everyone practices it. So with that being said, we need to have a little background on arguments, because when someone says the word argument, you think like, oh, two people bickering. You know, if you're married, as a man, your wife might ask you to do something, and you're like, oh, yes, dear, and then you don't do it, and then an argument ensues, and it's like you don't do it because you weren't really listening. And that's not sort of what I'm talking about when I say arguments. However, what I'm going to sort of go over here might actually help you in that aspect of your life. You know, some of the men in here might not like this part because they already think their wives are experts at arguing. So to give them any more ammo might be a little tough. So let's start with what an argument is and what makes for a good argument. Arguments are made up of premises and then a conclusion. Premises are like the statements or the propositions that then lead to that conclusion. Oftentimes in this world, you'll turn on a news channel and you'll see talking heads, politicians arguing with each other. And a lot of times what they're doing is they're just like shouting conclusions at each other. The arguments we're talking about is like, we're not really concerned with the conclusions. We're concerned with the premises. We're concerned with how we get to that conclusion. And that's what we're going to argue over, is those premises. And I think so much of like the political discourse in this country is just people arguing over conclusions, yet no one has even discussed how they got to those different conclusions. So the first thing we're going to go over is the form of an argument. These arguments are in the logical form. So the first thing that arguments have to be is what is called logically valid. Now, a logically valid argument isn't concerned with the truth of the argument. When you're looking at an argument, the first thing you must do is just assume that every aspect of the argument is true. And then the conclusion follow from the premises. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to write out an obviously wrong argument, but still show that it's logically valid. So here's like the first premise. Let's say all animals with wings can fly. Second premise, pigs have wings. Third premise, pigs are animals. And the conclusion would be, therefore, pigs can fly. Now, when you're looking at the validity of this argument, all you're doing is you assume everything about the argument is true. So if all these premises are true, does the conclusion follow from the premises? And then you would say, yes, I think it's pretty obvious that it does if you assume everything is true. Now, the next step to an argument is the truth of the premises. So this clearly, I would say, number one and number two are clearly not true. So therefore, we can say that this isn't a good argument. It is a valid argument, but not a good argument. So there's two things to differentiate between arguments. Now, the third aspect of an argument is that the premises must also be plausibly true. And you might say, well, you just said they should be true. Isn't that sort of saying the same thing? And it's not, because, for example, there could be an argument that said, at a certain time, Napoleon stepped in a puddle, and therefore his foot got wet. That might be true, but we don't know that's true. It's not plausibly true. So in the absence of a clear truth to an argument, the premises must be plausibly true. And this is where all the argument takes place. Because plausibility is going to be different for each person. And I've noticed in my life, and what you're going to do coming in here, if there's something that you necessarily agree with or is more towards your worldview, you tend to have this skeptic meter. And it's when it's something you like, you turn that skeptic meter way down. You kind of let things slide because you like the solution. And then when it's something you really disagree with, you turn that skeptic meter way up. You turn it up super high. And you question things to an extent that, well, I'll say that pure skepticism is basically can assume that nothing is real. And so academic skepticism sort of comes from that point. So I would encourage wherever you come from, because I'm going to present things from both sides, that you try to be aware of that skeptical dial that you have in you and sort of look at these things as unbiased as possible. And those of you who know me, as I said, I am a Christian, so I am biased, and I'm going to acknowledge that bias. And I'm going to try to still present these things as fairly as possible, and hopefully that you can do the same, and we're going to go from there. But first, before I go, does anybody have any questions about arguments in general? The form, does everybody understand the difference between a valid argument and a good argument? Okay. All right, so before we get into the first argument, I want to talk about sort of the outline for this class, because it's not just tonight. First thing I'm going to do is we're going to go over 3 arguments that are called cosmological arguments. Now that comes from the word cosmos, which is the universe, and logical, to know or knowledge. So these first 3 arguments are kind of intertwined. They're all related, and they have to do with our universe and sort of rules about our universe, the way our universe is, about existence. So then after that, we're going to deal with the ethical argument. And then after that, we're going to deal with a big objection to God's existence. So if those things kind of sound interesting to you, I'm hoping that you'll stick with the class. It's going to be every other Friday, and we'll announce it. So let's go to the first argument. This argument is called the argument from contingency. Sometimes it's called the Leibnizian cosmological argument, and it's based on from this guy Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. He was a 17th century German mathematician, philosopher. He co-founded calculus with Newton. He wrote and spoke German, Latin, French, I think Italian. He's a genius. Unfortunately for you, you're stuck with me. And I mean, I like a good fart joke. So basically, where this argument sort of originates is he posed this question, and this argument is it's not necessarily the best argument to start people on because it's sort of a very philosophical argument, and it can sort of get very heady. But his question was, why is there something rather than nothing? That was like his fundamental question. He thinks that is the first question. And so that is sort of why I want to start with this argument, because I think it is a good fundamental question. 200 years later, another philosopher, Martin Heidegger, and I quote, said, "Why are there beings rather than nothing? That is the question. Clearly, it is no ordinary question. Why is there anything at all rather than nothing? Obviously, this is the first of all questions." I put two other sources on your paper. This one, Dr. Alexander Pruss. He is alive today. He's a contemporary philosopher. He teaches at Baylor, and he is sort of the contemporary expert on this argument. So, I mean, if you're interested in knowing more, you can read him. And then sort of the form of the argument that I'm using comes from Dr. William Craig. He sort of simplifies a lot of this stuff and makes it easier to understand. So that's the form of the argument we're going to use. So now, let's get into the argument. I'm just going to read the premises off. The first premise is every existing thing has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Number two, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. Number three, the universe is an existing thing, and therefore the explanation of the existence of the universe is God. Now, my own thoughts are that this argument sort of hangs on the first two premises. I think the third premise, the universe is an existing thing, is sort of, it's hard to argue with that. Like I said, unless you're purely skeptical, you can, but then you don't really have room for discussion. It's like, okay, so what are we going to talk about? You don't think the universe exists. Enjoy your life. Yeah. I mean, this comes from the French, like Descartes, a famous French philosopher. He sort of posed that question, like, how can we know that anything exists? So, unless someone sort of disagrees, I think that the first two premises are where we're going to focus our discussion on. Now, does anybody have sort of, before I get into explanation, because maybe a question will sort of lead this way, does anybody have any questions about the first premise that you could think of? Okay, that's where sort of I wanted to go. So the reason this is called the argument from contingency is that we can think of Leibniz thought of two different types of existence. One is a contingent existence, and what that means is it is a dependent existence. That, think of anything that's existing in the world think of you, that yes, you exist, but you didn't have to exist. Your parents could have never met, something could have happened, and then their parents could have never met. You can think of this building, yes, it exists, but it didn't have to exist. And so that's what we mean when we say contingent, is that there are things that could not have existed. And Leibniz thought that the same could be said of the actual universe, the physical universe that's made up of all of space and all of time, that he believes that that is also a contingent thing. Now, Like Leibniz and I sort of agree, like it's possible that it could have not existed at all, or could have existed in a totally different form. And that's what he means by contingency of the universe. Does that make sense? So you don't think it's not so basically what you're saying is you think nothing is impossible. Hmm. Well, I mean, I sort of would disagree, and I think Leibniz would disagree in that I think I understand the nothing you're talking about, but Leibniz's definition of nothing was the absence of anything. So it can't be a something that is nothing. The nothingness he is referring to is the absence of anything. It has no properties. And okay, so okay, we're on the same page. The Okay, yeah, it's just okay. So yeah, that I mean, I think you're basically stating the first premise in a slightly different way. Um, so okay, back to contingency. We'll read the first premise. Every existing thing has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Now, here we get to the necessity, and necessity is sort of the opposite of contingency. A necessarily existing thing, must exist. If it exists, it is impossible for it to not exist. And Leibniz gave this definition to God. Like, God exists necessarily. That if God exists, he exists necessarily. This is a hard thing to sort of give examples of, because, I mean, my personal view as a Christian is that I think God is the only necessary being. However, in the field of mathematics, many mathematicians actually think that elements of mathematics are necessary. They're called mathematical realists, and they think that the number one actually exists, and not like the numeral one. That just is a symbol, but the number one actually exists. They believe that like sets exist, necessarily. And they're, like I said, they're called mathematical realists. So I mean that's sort of one example of something that could be necessary. Like I said, I don't think that mathematical objects really exist like they do. However, I will acknowledge that if they do exist, I think that they exist necessarily. Plato, he thought that there were certain concepts that existed necessarily. He put his moral values there, that there was a goodness, like goodness actually exists, justice actually exists. And then he had this sort of little g god, like I think he called it the demiurge, and he thinks that this being used those concepts to then create everything else. My view is a little differently, and I think that as a practicing Christian, that all these things sort of come from the nature of God. Like morality, goodness are in God's essential nature. It's not that he creates goodness or he determines what's good, because then it sort of becomes a little more arbitrary, because then he could then change his mind about what is good. I think it is actually in his nature what is good. Now, Tommy, I think you were asking a question about what I mean by necessity. Does that sort of clear it up a little bit? I mean, do you have like Do you have, like, you were starting to ask a question. Do you think okay. Yes, it is. And yeah, and then life kind of sprouts out from that. Hmm. I don't know who actually said that. I mean, these are good points. I don't want to go too. I mean, I guess it's my fault for bringing up good and morality. But these things are going to be discussed more fully when we get to the ethical arguments. Um, what I mean, I think I would say to that is that, if based on that quote and some of the things you're sort of leading to, is that those implications apply that there's no objective good, and so that makes all good and bad sort of subjective, and then that also makes sort of good and bad meaningless in a way. So, like pragmatism, you know. Yeah, I mean, it has no fire has no will, you know. Yes. It's not what I'm saying, but that's almost a good illustration. I mean, necessity has to do with explanations of why something exists. So that the word necessity in this premise is having to do with the property, like a property of something. So when something is necessary, like I said, it's impossible for it to not exist if it exists. And so if God exists and he is necessary, there is no possible world that he could not exist in. Like, you can't, a necessary being, you can't say, oh, I can conceive of a world where God doesn't exist, but then he exists in all these other worlds, where a necessary being exists in all worlds. That's why I said, like, the number one is the number one in all worlds. Like, you can call it something else, but it is still the number one. And it has to do with, like, that property. And like I said before, I don't necessarily think that the number one is a real existing thing. Does that sort of help you out there? I mean, this is like the necessity and contingency are sort of the crux of this argument. So that's sort of why I want to make sure these things are clear. Any other questions about the first premise? And these, again, this is more, I want to make sure everybody understands the argument before I actually get into objections to the argument. So we haven't even gotten there yet. Okay, so the second premise, the thing to understand about the first premise too is that we talked a lot about God, but the first premise doesn't introduce God. The first premise is just talking about explanations. And I mean, it's sort of hard to defend this premise because it sort of is intuitive. We like to think that everything has an explanation. I mean, it's sort of something we sort of feel. It's something that, okay, it's sort of the purpose of science is sort of to explain things, to figure out how things are, why things are. Even the word cosmological in the scientific field is the study of, like, how our universe came to be and, like, what are the nature of our universe. an external cause of the universe. I mean, that could be, yeah, that could be one of the causes of the universe. Yeah, I mean, that could be why our universe is contingent, because it has a cause. And then, like, Leibniz would say, but then what was the cause of that? You know, and this, I'm trying to avoid sort of scientific stuff, because the next argument we're going to talk about deals with much more of the scientific side. This, again, this is a philosophical point, and that, you know, in the world today, we talk of the multiverse, or there's this multitude of universes, there's this ensemble of universes, and, you know, we're only one of many. And, you know, Leibniz would then say, well, why is there many universes rather than no universes? And so that's like a philosophical question that I think, even if science one day explains how our universe came to be, like Leibniz would say that he still wants to know why. Like, why is it here? And at the time that, like, Leibniz was around, a common theory in science was that our universe was eternal in the past. Like, they call it the steady state universe, is that our universe had existed for infinite past. And Leibniz still would apply this to that. Like, yes, it may be infinite, but still, why is it here rather than not be here? So this argument doesn't have to do with the origin of the universe. That is a separate argument that we're going to be dealing with. So in logic, this is actually called the principle of sufficient reason, is basically what this first premise is saying. And that's that thing, like everything, some people will call it like a fact. I think Leibniz might actually said fact, that every fact has an explanation for it. And I think that's a little strong. I don't want to go that far. But I think that everything that actually exists, everything that's in a state of being, has an explanation. And so another good example to illustrate this, Richard Taylor he uses what he calls the glowing ball illustration. Glowing ball. He's another contemporary philosopher. And what you'll learn about philosophy is that they tend to just want you to use your imagination to picture things, which is sort of funny about it. But his illustration is that, imagine you're like walking through a forest and you come upon this like round, weirdly glowing ball. And he says that, would you just sort of like accept it? Like, just, would you not wonder what it is? Like, what's the reason? How did it get there? What is it? Now he says, imagine this glowing ball is the size of a tree and you come across it. Like, you still have the same questions about it. Then imagine it's the size of Earth. Imagine it's the size of the Milky Way. Imagine it's the size of the universe. That it still sort of demands an explanation. And I think it's also just, there's something in us as humans that we want to know why. We want to know why. And so I think that's a good illustration if you're having trouble sort of with that first premise. Now, the second premise is the premise that introduces God. It says, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. Now, on first read, this premise sort of seems rather bold. It's just like sort of asserting God right in it. So we got to sort of define some things. So first of all, what we mean by the universe, I sort of said before, is that it is all of space and time. If it is a multiverse, it is the whole multiverse. It is all the physical laws of the universe. It is all the objects of the universe. It is the subatomic universe. So the explanation of this, to be external from this, would have to be something that is spaceless, would have to be something that is timeless, has no shape. So that is why I think he calls the explanation God. Because you sort of try to conceive of something that meets a lot of those properties. I mean, we talked a little bit about numbers, but, you know, you think of numbers aren't really explanations or causes of anything. They just sort of exist on their own. So there's ways you can say that you cannot call this God if, like, that sort of, like, turns you off to be that abrupt. You know, you can say the universe has an explanation, and that is a timeless, spaceless, I don't know, sorry, my mind blanked. I don't know. I think he had a way to say it, But so there's a challenge to this. Okay, so maybe this is an objection. There's a challenge to this premise, and that you might, like I said, you might see, like, how does God all of a sudden come into this argument? The first premise didn't bring God in. So in this premise, there's another way you can say this, and it's what's called logically equivalent to this premise. And the way I say, the best way to understand that is, it's like, think of double negatives. And so I could say this premise in a different way. If the universe has no explanation of its existence, then atheism is true. And that is basically what is called a logically equivalent statement to premise 2, that you're basically double negating both things. So if the universe has no explanation of existence, then God cannot be the explanation. I really need a drink, I'm sorry. You can think about that. So do you guys understand what, like, logical equivalence means? Like I said, the best way to think of it is double negatives. They say it's a bad rule of English to apply a double negative, but in logic and philosophy, they use them all the time. Another way to think is that a logically equivalent statement is like they're both true. Both statements are true, or both statements are false. They're not contradictory statements. And so, like I said, you just negate both those two phrases, and you get the opposite. Not the opposite. You get the double negative. Like I said, you could say, if the universe, I already read it. If the universe has no explanation of existence, then atheism is true. You could say, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, never mind, I don't want to say that, sorry. Okay, anybody have any questions about that? Does anybody want to sort of add anything? Well, that actually goes to the first objection to this argument. Is that, no, I know, but it's a question that's kind of leading. It leads to basically the first premise, and that one of the objections is that the universe is actually what is called just a brute fact. Like, it is just there, that there is no explanation for it, and that, like I said, it's a brute fact. You may hear things like, the universe just is. Carl Sagan in Cosmos, remember that show Cosmos back, I don't know if that was the 70s or 80s? He said, in the beginning of the show, he said that the universe is all there ever was, all there ever is, and all there ever will be. So that often the rejection of the first premise is that the universe itself has no explanation of its existence. And like I said, I agree with you, is that I think it kind of cries out for an explanation. And that's where Leibniz was. What makes no sense? Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Well, like I said, first we have to define what we mean by the universe. Yes. So, like I said, the universe is all of space-time, all of existence, all, like, it's time, it's space, it's the laws of nature. Like I said, if it is a multiverse, it is the multiverse. And so, an explanation, if we go back to the first premise, an external cause, what would be external from that? And so I was saying, and this is where I meant to be more clear, the properties of that would be something that I think are the properties of God: timeless, spaceless, not subject to the laws of nature. Um, this, a lot of times this is preceded by sort of a nature of God class. I sort of, I wanted to get right into this because like that in itself could be a weeks long conversation. It's like, God exists, what is his nature? I will say that on both sides of the philosophical world, atheists and theist philosophers, they do acknowledge that like if God exists, he is what is called the maximal being. That anything that you can conceive of that might be above God, well, that would actually be a quality of God. Some people might say, in reference to this argument, well, you say everything has an explanation. What's God's explanation? Like, what caused God? And it's just like, well, if something outside of God caused God, that would be God. And so that's why we're talking about God is a necessary. His explanation is that he's a necessary being. Like I said, and that's why I use the number 1, mathematics. Yes. With those maximal properties, I will say, yeah, most of these arguments are good for more monotheistic views. Sort of these aren't pantheistic arguments. Like I said, this argument leads us to that sort of timeless, spaceless, supreme being. So, what's that? Those you would need like separate. Those would be separate arguments if you wanted to argue for that. Like I said, this argument is more towards, like I said, a monotheistic. It would work for Judaism, Islam, Christianity. This argument, what's called deism, sort of like a lot of scientists that will take on what's called deism. It's sort of that God exists, but we can't really know anything about him, sort of view. And that, I think a lot of them too take that view because they feel like it doesn't corrupt their science. Does that answer your question, Linda? Like, and that's what I said. Like, it seems very blunt that God is just in this premise. Like, you had, like, why is the explanation of the universe God? And I'm sort of, the answer is, like, what else could the explanation be? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Craig, actually, he says, he has it worded slightly different, and he says that if he words it in a different way sometimes, because he said this is sort of a little blunt way to put it. Any other questions? Yes. Yes, that it has an yeah, the argument sort of leads that way. Dr. Proust, he sort of words the argument that way. He says that you could say that everything in the universe is explanate. Like, sorry, what's your name? Yeah, but like he said, he talked about the Big Bang, and he said, well, would the Big Bang be an external cause? And like, so everything in the universe could be caused by, like, let's just say, for the sake of argument, the Big Bang. But the Big Bang also doesn't seem to be necessary. So then that, even though that one thing caused everything else, that thing would still be contingent. So that thing still needs an explanation. To say, like I said, even people who are, even atheistic scientists don't want to say that the universe or the Big Bang are necessary things. That means that they could not have happened. Like, it's impossible for the Big Bang not to have happened would be to say that the Big Bang is the cause of everything and the Big Bang is necessary. So does that make sense? What time is it? All right, so we're at 45 minutes. Like I said, there are other objections to this argument. I really sort of want to spend all class next time getting into those. We sort of brought up some, but I want to, like, open it up to any other sort of questions. They can be related to what we've gone over, but they could be more broad questions to see, like, if we're going to cover certain things that you might have questions about, and I can say, like, we're actually going to cover that in a later class. Try to give you a quick answer about some stuff. Um, Again, any basic understanding questions about this argument? Nope. Nope. No questions about anything else? Nothing at all. The third one. Okay. So, yes. So, I mean, like I said, okay, so she said she likes it. um, well, the reason, like I said in the beginning, I didn't want to get into. I think that premise is just obvious. So again, let's go back to the validity of arguments. So if you take all these premises and, like I said, let's assume they're all true, all three premises, then the conclusion number 4 would follow from the truth of the first three premises. Do you kind of see how that works? Okay. I mean, that happens in a lot of philosophical arguments. Is yeah, you ask if, and then you have to like you take the premise, the three premises, and then that if becomes a therefore. Because the argument is, I mean, I see what you're saying. It's sort of begging the question. Number 2 is like, if that's the conclusion, then why is it also one of the premises? Um, but you're taking the universe, and like you said, it sort of seems irrational that the universe doesn't have a explanation. So if the universe does have an explanation describing what we described as a universe, and God is what is God, we would say that this argument says that God therefore is the explanation of the universe. So that's man, now you got me stumped. Okay. Okay. So let's go. So what we were talking about before of necessary beings, and I talked about numbers. Um, the, Back to Plato, and he like he said, he had many things that he thought were necessary. One of those things that he thought was like timeless, spaceless, could be like a mind, like a willful mind. Is how he described it. That a mind could exist necessarily outside of time and space, and so in that sense, you can think of God as like a willful mind, a self, a person. We call this like the cause of the universe in this argument is a person-based thing. It's willful. Um, Again, like I said, these are uh, some of the nature of God. A lot of this has to come from like further reading of Leibniz. But if it's sort of not that, like if it's, how do I want to phrase this? Like if it's just sort of a mechanical sort of cause, like it's arbitrary, like it's has no will, has no creative purpose. Seems like it wouldn't be necessary. It could just be another aspect of the universe, like we talked about the Big Bang. Yeah, its purpose. Yes, that's Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. Yeah. This, like I said, this I'm showing how arguments can be valid, but be wrong, and and that's why you go through each premise, and that's what I said you can do here. No, no, no. That's not like I would like the major objections to this argument. I'm going to wait till next session. I mean, some of them sort of came up, but there's like bigger ones. Tommy, do you have a question? Yeah, that's what they always say. You didn't have a question, did you, John? I mean, I think I agree with that. I think that could work there. Um, and yeah, like I don't see any objection with that. Like, I mean, that, and that's sort of what this argument is saying, is that basically anything that is contingent needs a sort of necessary first cause to come into existence, and that is sort of what this argument sort of leads to. So I guess it sort of leads to that type of God, like a causal God, a God who sort of causes being. Oh, I need another drink. Dave, I don't know how you do this. You can think of some more questions. That's a good. He made me think of something. You could also reword number 3 to say that the universe is an existing thing with an explanation. I think that would also help, like number 2 and number 4, to see the difference. Where would you add it? Is a necessary thing. Yeah, I mean, you could say if number 2 could be if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation must be necessary. There are multiple ways to sort of word these things. On that note, let me read. This is sort of, but I'll read another version of this argument that I sort of didn't want to read because it can be kind of complex. But this is Dr. Alexander Pruse's version of this argument. And again, I might be opening a can of worms reading this, but what he said. What's that? Okay, good. He says this is a 5-step argument. So, number 1, every contingent fact has an explanation. Number 2, there is a contingent fact that includes all other contingent facts. Number 3, therefore, there is an explanation of that causal contingent fact. Number 4, this explanation must involve a necessary being. Therefore, this necessary being is God. So that's his version. It's the same argument, but that's the way he phrases it. And there are other versions. And like I said, we've sort of thought you can edit this argument sort of in a number of ways. I thought this another way is the first one we could say that. Now I can't think. I was trying to change the first one to make it a little less complicated. But I like what John said. I mean, I think you're right about sort of we haven't explained what God is. And that could sort of come up in the discussion of the second premise, I think, a little more. I sort of don't have I don't have all the notes to go to an explanation of God, because a lot of that sort of too is a doctrinal thing that theologians will just, like a doctrine of God, like what is God's nature. Is that a question? Oh, okay. I mean, I think I understand what you're saying. Um, it's sort of like there's a perception of time as as opposed to there's also like a physical quality of time though that is a mathematical equation that's based on mass and acceleration. Um, I mean, what you're sort of saying is that like the universe being an existing thing is sort of comes into question. I call that sort of like the ultimate skeptical view. And I said there's nothing wrong with it, but it, it's sort of like hard to argue that like against that because you're basically saying we're not even here right now, you know. And you can say like the ultimate skeptic can say like, okay, this is on illusion. Okay, well then we're assuming the illusion is true just so we can have this discussion. It was like Descartes did that a lot. He's the one I know. I don't know Plato. Um, but like, yeah, Descartes said like the only way, you know, to come to knowledge, he says you have to assume that nothing exists, and then you can try to figure out what's real based on that premise. Like I said, it's sort of hard to have any sort of discussion when you're under the that is your starting point, you know. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I actually didn't create this argument, but um, yeah, in a way. I mean, I guess I will ask you the question: what other explanations do you think there could be? I mean, so that's sort of like, yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the objection we're going to talk about next time. That's the major objection to this argument, and that's what I said before about how they call it a brute fact that the universe is just there. What I said about Carl Sagan's quote about the cosmos, and again, that's a big part of what we're going to discuss next time. It's been yeah, it's been an hour. One final. Anybody have any more final questions? Mm-hmm. No, it wouldn't be of the universe. It's not of the universe. It depends on it depends on what you mean by nature. Like that was more when I was talking about the attributes of God, not that the universe. I'm not saying that the universe exists because it is some attribute of God. You know, that's not. I know I'm saying that's what you're saying, but yeah, there's something outside of the universe, and like I said, the things that we can sort of conceive of that exist outside of the universe, as I said, have to be timeless, spaceless, have to have like, I think, a creative will. There has to be some sort of will to create. Yes, true. So is the word like before, prior, outside. That, I mean, the the semantics of language, you get us in trouble a lot here, because outside is a physical sort of descriptor and God has no physical form, you know. So it's a good question. And like I said, being a Christian, I agree with that. But then, how do you talk to someone who doesn't know, has no faith, you know, has no understanding of sort of even the Christian view of the world? And so, like, when I was going back to describing arguments in the first part, when we talked about plausibility, that's like, people are going to have different levels of plausibility. Like, some people might think, yes, they like the idea of God, so they turn that skeptic meter way down, and they're like, oh, I really like this argument just because it has God in it, and I already believe in God. And so my goal is not, and the goal of these arguments is not to prove God, and that's sort of a big misnomer. And the word proof and prove is actually a mathematical term. I'm sort of trying to illustrate that there are things outside of religious belief that might give someone a logical view of God. That it's not totally like illogical. It's not just like, it doesn't have to just be like blind faith. And I'm not criticizing that at all. I'm just saying that, when someone says like, oh, you just believe in this Christian nonsense, you can then say, well, there's other reasons to believe that there might be something more than just this physical universe.